Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this finalist open forum for our next Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning and Dean of the College of Undergraduate Studies. My name is Barry Hoffman-Ruddy, and I'm representing the Faculty Senate. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Theodorea Regina Berry. She is a professor and chair in the Department of African Studies in the College of Social Sciences at San Jose State University in California. She earned her Doctor of Education in Curriculum and Social Inquiry, her Educational Specialist degree in Leadership and Curriculum and Teaching, and her Master's of Education in Interdisciplinary Studies for Curriculum and Instruction, all from National Louis University in Chicago. She earned her Bachelor's degree in Communications from Slippery Rock University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Berry is a pioneer scholar on critical race feminism in the context of education and has published various journal articles, books, and book chapters as part of her research. Dr. Berry will present and then answer questions from the audience, and you can learn more about her qualifications and background from the newsroom section of the Provost website. Let's give her a big welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. I really appreciate your presence here. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you on the subject of strategic alignment to foster student success, strengthening the links between academic and student success. And I want to give special thanks to the search committee. I know how much work and time and effort it takes to pull together all the moving parts necessary for a successful search from start to finish. And so I applaud you on all of your efforts this afternoon. Let's see if we can't get this going. Oh, there we go. So I'm a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and grew up in an area, in a neighborhood called Germantown. And in Philadelphia, there are two large rivers, one of which most people know about, the Delaware River, because if you know anything about American history, you know about George Washington sailing on the Delaware River. But the other one is a river that when most people see the word might not necessarily understand how to pronounce it. In Philadelphia, we call it the Schuylkill River. And the Schuylkill River runs from northeast to southwest through the city and feeds into the Delaware River and then out to the Chesapeake Bay. And it's an important body of water in the city of Philadelphia because it is a body of water that transports from the upper part of the state out through southeastern Pennsylvania. And along the Schuylkill River running through the city is what we call the drive, the river drives that run east and west along the river. And in Germantown, you can pick up what we now call Kelly Drive, named for John B. Kelly Jr., who's a former Olympic rower and is the brother of Princess Grace of Monaco, who was Grace Kelly formerly. When I was growing up, Kelly Drive was known as East River Drive. And the West River Drive on the other side of the river is now known as Martin Luther King Drive. And what's important that you see here is a picture of the Schuylkill River prior to the development of the river drives running along the Schuylkill River and various trees that line each of the banks of the river. Now, typically when we think about banks of a river and what's on the banks of the river is providing transport to all kinds of fish and fowl, but the trees aren't necessarily connected to the river outside of being a water source. But the river and the trees are equally important in the landscape. I'm going to get to why this is important in just a minute. This is a later picture of the Schuylkill River, And one of the bridges, this is actually the Manioc Bridge that crosses the river on the farther northern side of the city. And like any other major body of water, if you want to get from one side to the other, you have two options. You can go by the water or you can cross a bridge. The bridge is the link that strengthens the passage between the both sides of the river. And it's especially important for people who want to bypass having to make the loop all the way around from one side of the river drive to the other. Now, while the route is scenic, it isn't always efficient. And so bridges like this make it much more efficient to transverse the river. So when we think about strategic alignment, we have to think about it, at least I think about it, in relationship to this notion of a body of water, like a river, with banks and links that cross it from one side to the other, and ways in which people can use the river to transport to get from one end to the other. So when we think about strategic alignment, we first have to think about this notion of strategic as an adjective relating to the identification of long-term or overall aims or interests and the means of achieving them. Alignment as a noun, as in a position of agreement or alliance. And strategic alignment being the process of bringing the actions of an organization's divisions and staff members into line with the organization's planned objectives. So when we think about this notion of strategic alignment in relationship to this notion of a river and its banks and bridges, we can think about the river being actually the organization. And this organization, in this case, being the educational institution. And to bring things in alignment with the objectives of that organization, you have to have a means of achieving that. What's going to get people to where they want to go? And that would be a link in this case, a bridge, a connecting structure that will allow individuals to figure out how to get from one side to the other in a more efficient manner. When we think about strategic alignment and its links in relationship to academics, we have to think about this notion of academics being related to a college or an educational institution. And that student success in relationship to academics features these three very key components. First of which, retention. It's one thing to get students enrolled, it's something else for them to stay in and gain the knowledge that they aspire to. The second part being achievement, and this notion of what it means to make benchmarks or to do things significant to their movement through their degree program. And then advancement. What is the ultimate success in this case, which most people measure in relationship to graduation? So when I think about this notion of strategic alignment in relationship to student success, I go back to my roots as a curriculum theorist. Post-reconceptualist curriculum theorists think about the ways in which two major questions in curriculum are connected to notions of identity for students. The two questions are centered on Herbert Spencer's work, in 1852, where he asked, what knowledge is most worth knowing? And who determines what knowledge is most worth knowing? Those of us who engage in this notion of backward design start with the end in mind. So when we're thinking about strategic alignment in relation to student success, what is success? What do we want a student to look like when they finish a particular degree program at a particular institution? So if we're thinking about that from a curriculum theory perspective, we have to ask then, what knowledge must students possess that would lead to success? Who determines what knowledge is important for success? And then what pathways or routes are likely to provide access to this knowledge? And finally, who are the stakeholders, facilitators, and creators of the knowledge that leads to this success? So in relationship to the University of Central Florida, I posed the question then, thinking of the end in mind, what makes for a successful UCF student? If you had to draw a model of what this student would look like, and it's actually an exercise that I have had students do in the past to envision themselves, their future selves, and to draw that future self and all of the things that they would have gained from their 2-year, 4-year, 6-year experience at the institution, and what that would look like. And to then be able to articulate the attributes and characteristics of their future selves. And to talk about it then in terms of what knowledge did they gain, how did they gain that knowledge, how might that knowledge be useful to their future selves, and who decided what was important for them to know. So in thinking about those things, I asked these 2 questions. What steps should we consider to develop this student? If we're thinking about the end in mind, where do we begin? And then the second question, what do we need to develop this student? What tools, what resources, what knowledge, what experiences might be helpful in relationship to getting to the student that would be deemed a successful University of Central Florida student? So I think about this in relationship to these 2 questions, leaning on my background as a post-reconceptualist curriculum theorist. I first start out with the questions that I've asked at the beginning around backward design, to get to the student that we want to see. What knowledge must these students possess? Who determines it? What are the pathways and the routes to it? Who are the stakeholders and facilitators and creators? In relationship to my post-reconceptualist questions about what knowledge is most worth knowing, who determines what knowledge is most worth knowing, and what factors from our Afrocentric past inform our present understandings of knowledge. Because as a post-reconceptualist, thinking about the knowledge that influences identity, for me, that rests in knowledge that is centered on the work of Black scholars and this notion of knowledge and curriculum. So that would then lean on the work of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Anna Julia Cooper, and Elaine Locke, and many others from the late 19th century, early 20th century, who gave us lots of information around the kinds of things that were important for students to know and be able to do, but from an Afrocentric perspective. So when thinking about those questions in relationship to my own work, I can then think about how to plug in responses to these questions. So these might be the steps to help us get to the successful student by starting with the questions in mind. So we first then have to then consider with these questions, what are our resources? What's the landscape look like? In traditional higher education, student success has sat on the opposite bank of the river from the academics. What the college professors did in the classroom had very little connection to the kinds of things that students needed resourcefully in order to be successful in schools. Now, the good news is we don't operate so much in these silos anymore. But this is our history, and we have to recognize that educational institutions were established in this manner and are, for many reasons, still functioning and structured in this manner. So across the country, we have a provost who is the academic officer. We have deans who oversee colleges based on discipline. We have department chairs who oversee departments based on programs. And oftentimes these components don't have a lot of conversation with each other, but furthermore, they don't have a lot of conversation with folks who typically, in traditional settings, deal with student success. People who run success centers. So at my current institution, there are success centers that are developed based on affinity groups. So there's a Black Student Success Center, a Latinx Student Success Center, a Gender Equity Center, a Pride Center, who are all thinking about curriculum in the context of these students' identities. But how often do we see faculty engaged in spaces like that? A multicultural center, right? Where do we see faculty in those spaces? When we talk about transition services, transfer services, tutoring services, counseling services, where do we see faculty in those spaces? And vice versa. Where do we see these individuals in classroom spaces or in curriculum? So the traditional model, while it's not as prevalent or as obvious as it once was, still has some spaces present in our higher education institutions. So when we think about these traditional pathways, we see that colleges, departments, and disciplines and programs tend to be very structured in much the same way that many of us experienced them when we were in four-year institutions. Not much has changed on this side. A little bit more has changed on this side because higher education scholarship has deemed it important to consider many of the things that happen on the academic side when developing advisory boards and councils, when thinking about student success centers, multicultural centers, affinity centers that support students, when thinking about different kinds of programs and activities that happen on the student affairs side that have some impact on students' ability to be successful academically and will have impact on retention, will have impact on achievement, and will have impact on success, and which we define as graduation in this space. So right now, at this particular institution, the alignment for success is sort of organized into two different camps that have some dialogue with each other according to the organizational charts that I've reviewed thus far. And so out of the academic side of the house, under the Provost and VP for Academic Affairs is the position for Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and a Dean for Undergraduate Studies, which has in that organization components that deal with student success, that deal with student learning. Many of the things that we traditionally, in our old route along the proverbial river, would have been on the opposite side of the river. But now we're thinking about that in relationship to what kinds of things educators, the college professors, need to know and be able to do in order to lend to retention, to lend to achievement, to lend to success. And even when thinking about the position of the VP for Student Development and Enrollment Services and the associate VPs that function under there, the roles in which they provide service for, think about curriculum and the knowledge most worth knowing that lends itself to these notions of retention, achievement, and success. And so in these spaces, we see these links that now appear, and many institutions are now moving in this kind of direction, including the institution where I'm currently housed. So we find that now, for instance, at my current institution, the African American Black Student Success Center engages in work that helps students in relationship to achievement, helping them to work with faculty on things like alternative spring break, opportunities for study, for faculty-led programs, which is our version of study abroad, for workshops and seminars that help students with things like applying for graduate school and business etiquette, for getting ready to function in the business world. And so those kinds of things are now starting to create some bridges, some links from one side of the proverbial river to the other. But how do we improve on that? How do we think about that differently so that we have more pathways along the proverbial river by which students can access success? Where are the other points or junctures where we can answer the questions around the knowledge most worth knowing? And more importantly, where is the student voice in relationship to being able to answer that question? And how do we get that heard in a more constructive way that lends to greater success for more students? So, strengthening the links, building more bridges and pathways to success has brought me to thinking about some ways in which this can be done in a number of different ways in different spaces. And so first of all, I have to admit that I'm sort of a self-described data geek, right? So every time somebody asks me a question in relationship to what should we do first or next, the first question I'm going to ask is, where's the data? What kind of data, empirical data, quantitatively and qualitatively, do we already have that might give us a clue about what direction we move into in relationship to these questions? And so in doing that, I'm also thinking about what kinds of data don't we typically acquire? Because course evaluations, everybody does them. There's the quantitative part where some students circle some numbers. Sometimes they're not even paying attention to what numbers they've chosen on the evaluation. They're just clicking something on the screen just to say they did it, especially if there's extra credit involved, right? But nonetheless, we know that it's giving us something, but it's not giving us everything. We're not knowing everything from that. And a lot of students don't fill in the qualitative portion of the course evaluation, where students could provide us with some substantive narrative around the experience that they had in a particular course. But some students do. And that even is going to be slightly biased given the experience that that student might have had with a particular instructor. So if that instructor, for some reason, decided that they weren't accepting late work, and a student felt like if that instructor had been a little more flexible, they could have gotten an A instead of a B, well, the course evaluation is going to read exactly like that. So it's not necessarily going to be helpful to that instructor in relationship to strengthening the link or the bridge in relationship to being a better instructor and then offering a better experience to future students. And part of the reason why I bring that up is because my current students have decided that one of the ways in which they will decide which instructor for which section of a course they're going to take is to go to Rate My Professor. They use it as if it is hard science. And it is incredible that they do not understand the biases built into that particular instrument. But they will plan their schedule and then go into Rate My Professor and decide whether or not they're going to take that class with that instructor versus somebody else. And I have to sit down and speak with them and say, you know, what is it about that rating that is informative to you? And what do you think you really need to know about this instructor before you make the decision to take that class with that instructor versus someone else? And then, of course, I get the head scratching, like, oh, I didn't think about it like that. My friends just say, just go to Rate My Professor before you choose a class. But part of what we don't do is get substantive, qualitative feedback from students about their learning experiences. Now, part of the reason why we don't do it is because it is arduous work to code for that data, to be able to find meaningful work in it. So that doesn't mean we have to do it all the time, but I think there would be some usefulness in relationship to creating such reports so that we could have something in addition to course evaluations that might give us more meaningful information. One of the other things that might be helpful to be able to do, we do course evaluations, but we don't get a lot of information from students about their programs and how well they think that their individual programs are doing. And so student assessment of learning within the discipline that they're getting their degree in or their program might prove helpful in relationship to a holistic viewpoint of their experience versus just a course evaluation. Discipline and program-based assessment and evaluation is significantly important, also in relationship to this notion of program reviews. Certain departments and certain disciplines have regular program reviews that happen externally. So someone comes in from outside and takes a look at it, and some programs get accreditation through their particular discipline. Discipline-based programming, student programming. So what I mean by that is some departments are really good at doing programs or activities, workshops that enhance what students are learning in their departments. And in my experiences, working as a graduate advisor at record for a PhD program, I found that when I was very explicit about certain workshops or seminars that students should participate in, and being very explicit about the ways in which a workshop or a seminar might, in fact, assist them in a research class they were taking, or in a methods class, or in a theory class, students actually had more opportunities to enhance their learning that way. And so having those kinds of opportunities are helpful. Connecting community and industry with student engagement and student advising. One of the things that we've heard a lot over the last few years is how to help connect students to industry. Not only just to get a job, but to get an understanding of the reality of their career field. So how do we then do better connections with community and industry for more than just the internship experience, but allowing folks to come in to departments and programs from the community to provide some insights. And so one of the things I've done as the department chair for African American Studies, I've brought in Black or African American professionals from a variety of different fields into my department to talk about their experiences, not only in their field, but what does it mean to be an African American or Black person who is a computer engineer at Microsoft, or who works at Netflix doing graphic design, and the kinds of things to consider and how their voices and experiences give input to that industry in ways that might not be obvious to the average consumer. Creating discipline-based program outreach coordinators. It's something I've also done in my current position, where being very explicit about someone in my department whose sole responsibility is to connect to community, to attend events at community colleges, to attend community events, to do recruitment, to engage with community members and community organizations. And so my outreach coordinator attends regular NAACP meetings, attends community functions at the African American Community Service Agency, is doing some other things at community colleges where they have Black student unions at those community colleges and at the local high schools. And so that we have a visible presence, that we're part of the community and not just that institution over there. The other thing that I've done, and my experience as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the graduate school at the University of Texas, San Antonio, was to work with industry to create something we called adjunct professors. Those are individuals who basically work for an industry, and in this case, we were working directly with military personnel who were basically working with graduate students and undergraduate students on research. But to do that with the university, we created a memorandum of understanding so that these individuals could be, in fact, appointed as faculty for the university for the purpose of guiding students through their research at their facilities. And it was a wonderful relationship where students got hands-on direct experience working in a research field with a researcher who also had the opportunity then of being a professor for the institution. Faculty in residence programs have been really successful at my current institution and my previous institution, where there are faculty members who get course releases for being assigned to student centers to do work with students and to do research in their particular fields. And so there's a faculty in residence at the African American Black Student Success Center, at the Latinx Center, at the Gender Equity Center. And these are individuals who not only provide academic support to those students, but also have the capability of engaging in research with the students and on their own based on those particular areas. What's also important in relationship to the work I've done over my time in my professional academic career is the ability to build capacity toward culturally competent faculty. At most colleges and universities, at least 45% of the faculty on campuses are self-identified as white. And our campuses are becoming increasingly diverse. We do not expect that the population of faculty is going to change overnight because folks have to come through doctoral programs and get appointed and so forth and so on. It takes time to change the actual demographic of any particular institution. But what I think is more important is that faculty have the ability to reach students, to understand their experiences and incorporate them into the context of curriculum. And I think it's been an important endeavor to ensure that faculty have the skill set necessary to be able to do that. And then finally, one of the other things that I think is important in relationship to strengthening those links is for colleges and departments to have student-faculty interface moments built into sort of the mentoring, advising experience. And so, for instance, at my current institution, we have a program called Coffee with a Professor. Students get a free Starbucks card, which they love. It has $12 on it, so there's only so much Starbucks you're gonna get. But they can meet up with a faculty member and talk about their career options, their aspirations, talk about the course, talk about whatever it is that they think might be important to the student in that moment. And something about having that kind of one-on-one time with a faculty member and getting some inspiration and insights about their identity as a student has proven really helpful to student populations. And so when we think about the River Drive today, and the links that have been strengthened over the years since I was a young child, it's a very different space now. The River Drive has a bike trail, has a walking trail, there is Boathouse Row along one section where a lot of the crew teams are. It is still equally as scenic as it has ever been, and then there are now probably about a good 6 to 7 bridges that cross the Schuylkill River from one end to the other. My hope is that as we move through higher education, we will build not only multiple pathways along the route for students to get to success, but strengthening the links and adding additional bridges and connecting structures so that students have more opportunity to succeed. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Based upon your research of the institution and what you have learned today, being on campus, what do you think your greatest challenge will be if you're selected for this position?
Initially, the greatest challenge of coming into any position brand new is trying to do my best to get to know all of the stakeholders and what's significantly important to students in that particular space. Building that synergy between the stakeholders and student interest is most important to me as an academic leader. And it takes time to get that kind of information and to do it right, and to do it right the first time, so that as you're continuing to build capacity, you're starting out with a strong foundation. Anything less than that, if you try to jump in and just start doing stuff, is likely to rattle a few cages unnecessarily.
Kind of following up a little bit more with that, how would you describe maybe your approach, whether it's leading disruption or managing change, your approach in managing?
Okay, so I think I've addressed this question a couple of times during the course of the day. And so I want to say a couple of things to give you some backdrop and framing for it. The first of which is I am a self-described type A personality. And kind of like a recovering cookie addict, right? Just can't have too many chocolate chips at one time. I've recognized when there's too many chocolate chips, right? So I have, over the years, modified my approach to things to be much more collaborative. So I would describe my leadership style as a collaborative leadership style. I value people's input and their skill sets and their capabilities. And I think without valuing those things, I would certainly be starting off on the wrong foot to begin with. That being said, when dealing with change, it's in human nature that we just don't do change well. Some of us do change better than others of us, but change is hard for human beings. And I don't necessarily see myself as an exception to that. But what I do see myself as someone who has accepted that change will happen. It's just part of life. But how we deal with change is what makes the difference. And so the first piece of that for me is transparency. It's significantly important that everybody knows as much as they can know in order to be able to function appropriately. And without being transparent, there are gaps and spaces available for problems to pop up. And then you can't build trust amongst the people that you work with. Now, that being said, in any academic leadership position, there are going to be moments where confidentiality is necessary. And so for me, what that means is when a decision gets made where information can't be shared for a particular reason, I typically tell the folks I'm working with, here's what we have to do, and here's how we need to do it. And unfortunately, additional information regarding this matter can't be provided at this time, but I'm hoping that in the best interest of our students that we will carry out the task at hand. And those moments are just going to happen no matter how comfortable or uncomfortable we might feel about them. But for me, in relationship to dealing with change and some of the things that happen, if we can give out as much information as we can give out and provide as much support as we can to adapt to the things that are happening, we have better chances for success.
I
Yes.
don't me to hog all the questions. But I do understand because that you are coming from an HSI institution as well. Maybe you've been at a couple.
I've been at a couple,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, so can you share a little bit about, we're fairly new to this, what you've observed in the best practices or how we should serve our Hispanic and Latinx community?
Sure. So to reiterate and to reemphasize, I've served at two HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions. This is my second one, San Jose State. I also served at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Student population levels are about the same, about 40,000 students at each institution, where the vast majority of the students self-identify as Latinx or Chicanx. In that case, one of the things that I have found to be extremely successful for both of these institutions is the honoring of culture. And we do our best to do that, particularly in environments that have been traditionally sort of cordoned off as student success spaces on campus. And so having students to have opportunities to have resources, workshops, seminars, activities, et cetera, that are connected to their experiences, and particularly if they connect to their experiences and provide some support to academics, they're hugely successful. It doesn't mean that we have reached any level of perfection at any one of these institutions, or that any HSI has reached any level of perfection at all. It is an ongoing challenge because there's so much more to know about the multiple kinds of experiences that they have. So for instance, we can't assume that all students who self-identify as Latinx or Chicanx are first-generation college students. But at the same time, those who are need something different from those who aren't. We can't assume also that all Chicanx or Latinx students speak Spanish. When I was in Texas, lots of those students didn't speak Spanish because of the history of Spanish-speaking people in Texas. They have parents and grandparents who were forbidden to learn Spanish in school. And so as a result, they raised children who never learned to speak Spanish, but they have Spanish surnames. And so people will oftentimes walk up to people speaking in Spanish, and the students will look at them like, I have no idea what you're saying. But in California, it is quite often the case that most of the students who are on our campus are bilingual and fluently bilingual. But the other side of that coin in California is that people make the assumption that the vast majority of our students are from Mexico. When you look at that side of the world, it should be obvious to a lot of people, but it's not, that you have a lot of folks who come from places like Guatemala, like Honduras, El Salvador, and they are on our campuses. And in fact, one of the things that our current Latinx Center is dealing with is the fact that we have an increasing population of Panamanian students who are phenotypically Black, but they only speak Spanish. So, and so the university is grappling with the cross-pollination of their identities and ensuring that students who have these identities can check both boxes, right? Which was a problem in Texas, by the way, because in Texas, the state system wouldn't allow students who were phenotypically Black but self-identified as Latinx to check both boxes. And that created a problem. In fact, we lost a faculty member over that because he's Puerto Rican and wanted to self-identify as both Black and Latinx, and the Human Resources Center told him no, and he left, right? But this is part of the challenge of dealing with being at an HSI. The good news is that the more we learn, the better we are getting at addressing all of the multiple and intersecting identities and situations in relationship to this very important population of our student body. Yes, ma'am.
You shared several examples
an environment where faculty and staff, who many are already doing student success interventions to further engender student success with UCF?
Okay, I'm probably going to answer this in a very unpopular way. Faculty members are counting beans because the academy makes us count beans. And if you don't know what I mean by counting beans, let me be more explicit. Tenure and promotion is about how everything counts. So at the end of the day, if faculty are already doing it, there's a 50-50 chance that they're not necessarily doing it to count it for something, or that it will count for something in relationship to tenure and promotion. In which case, institutions need to become more creative about how to help a faculty member feel more incentivized about engaging in the work if they're already doing it, and to get faculty members who aren't already doing it to have the incentive to do it. Now, the sad truth is that's how we function, right? And it's a sad truth because it should always be about what the student needs first. But the reality is faculty want to keep their jobs, right? So they got to count beans. And that's the reality of the situation. Now, staff who do it, there are a variety of different reasons because it depends on what that staff person's position is. And so it gets a little more complicated there. So if a staff member is doing it and part of their job already is about advising students, let's say, but then they've developed something that makes advising students from a particular population more meaningful to that group, but they're not necessarily getting credit for it, right? How do we then motivate them to do that? Is there a way in the university system to then reward or provide more support for a staff person who is doing something above and beyond just what the job description says? Now, certain institutions have that already built in. If UCF doesn't, it might be something that needs to be explored in relationship to ensuring that that becomes not only something that continues to happen, but also maybe that staff person becomes the point person for training other people on how to engage in that process and finding a way then to reward them for engaging in that practice. So part of it depends on what their role is, and part of it depends on what systems are already in place for providing an incentive for it already, and what systems might need to be in place to create that incentive. I hope I answered your question. Yes, sir.
Kind of in relation, my name's Dan Murphy, I'm an associate professor of history here. You said institutions need to be creative in how they incentivize their faculty. Do you have any ideas on that? Any examples, suggestions?
Sure. So part of it depends on where the faculty are in their tenure line. If it's tenure track people, it's probably a little bit easier to build some stuff in that helps that count. And so, for instance, when I was at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia for a few years, and I had a wonderful dean who has since retired there, who created in the programs an innovation stipend, essentially, that came out of his budget, right? So that clearly number one thing was that he was willing to invest. So he didn't go to the provost, he didn't go to the president, he took money out of his own budget and creative innovation program stipends. And basically said, if you are a junior faculty member and you do something innovative and defined what innovative was, then I'm gonna give you extra money for a stipend that you can use for research or you can use for travel, that sort of thing, right? Now, mind you, Mercer is private, so that also impacts on the way money moves, right? Because money moves differently in private spaces than it does in public spaces. when I was at the University of Texas at San Antonio, I had a dean who did an application for research awards that could go to both tenure track and tenured faculty, but the qualifications for tenure track people were slightly different than the qualifications for tenured people. But what she called a research award could also be connected to service that was not being done already in that unit. So for instance, something like a program where you're doing special kind of advising for a particular affinity group of students, and you build a model and provide information to other folks in relationship to how to carry out the model, that would qualify for something like this research award where you could use the money for whatever you wanted to use it for. And so deans, I know, have some room to do that. Provosts have more room because they have more money. Right? Let's be honest about that. So at the end of the day, it's about thinking about the ways in which a reward or an incentive or innovation could be awarded in such a way that promotes people's willingness to engage more, and not just for the money, but also for the benefit of doing something that's beneficial for students. But sometimes people need to know what that looks like too. And they need a script or a plan or a set of criterion so that they can think about their work a little bit differently in relationship to this notion of what does it mean to engage in something innovative that also supports students, right? So those are just a couple of things that I think might be useful in that scenario.
If there aren't any other questions, we want to thank you for your time and presenting to us and answering all of our questions. Also, there's more information on the Provost Newsroom website. Please feel free to find it there.
And thank you to everyone.